Now let's turn and look at Nietzsche's view of good and evil. He wrote a work, Beyond Good and Evil, and that delves deeply into his moral outlook on life. But the truth be known, about half of everything Nietzsche wrote was about morality. He wrote another work, Genealogy of Morals, for example. And so he is always attacking in all these books what we would call traditional morality today. So he follows the logic of naturalism. If God truly does not exist, and that's what he believes, but God is just a fairy tale, if you will, long believed by civilization for its own purposes, then there's an enormous problem that we face, and that's morality. So Nietzsche definitely thinks God is dead and never really lived. Therefore, all the morals, all the values and rules based upon God are really a pure sham, which he will call either a slave ethic or a herd ethic, both meaning the same thing, just different terms. Now, Copernicus did revolutionize our understanding of the cosmos in 1543 with his heliocentric theory. The Earth is not the center. Kant revolutionized our understanding of knowledge by changing the center of the knowing subject. And now Nietzsche is going to revolutionize morality by putting us at the center of values. So his Transvaluation project, that's what he called the Transvaluation of Values, is going to put each person at the center of values creation. There is now no transcendent morality. There's no good and evil in a transcendent sense like there is from the Christian worldview, Judaic worldview, or Islam, or Platonism, and so forth and so on. Now each person is pretty much put in the driver's seat and has to determine what good and evil is for himself or herself, okay? So that's why he named the book Beyond Good and Evil. And the truth be known, there really is no such thing as good and evil. There's only things you like and things you don't like. But there is no actual good or evil. Now, he does use the term slave morality versus master morality, okay, a lot. The slave morality is sometimes what he calls a herd morality or a herd ethic. The morality is a kind of a herd instinct in the individual, he says, okay? So his tweet, Morality is the Herd Instinct in the Individual, explains what traditional morality is from his point of view. And it is the masses coming together like a herd to control morality for their own purposes, okay? So he holds that what's happened in Western civilization is that the masses get together, the weak people get together, make rules, and then use those rules, laws if you will, to control the truly strong people, okay? And so you can see this back in Plato in his Republic as well. Glaucon pretty much held this view in the early books of the Republic, where he said that, something to this effect, that the weak people just get together to control the strong, okay? And Nietzsche says, yes, that's true, but this way of ethics, this way of morality is actually going to destroy humanity, he says. And so he puts in his place something that we would call today ethical egoism. He doesn't exactly use that term. He does use the term egoistic, but he does claim that each one of us is put into a kind of ethical center, okay? Just as Kant put you within the epistemological center, now Nietzsche's put you into the moral center. Each person should follow the principle of egoism, or a kind of enlightened selfishness, an enlightened self-interest, if you will. This way of thinking about values is popular today, by the way, and it does seem to send our society deeper into a kind of a hyper-individualism. It pairs with our hyper-individualistic views. What's right for me is not right for you, and so on and so forth, you see. Okay. In short, everyone should act according to the principle of self-interest. Now, this view has a lot of problems, but that doesn't mean it's not popular, okay? Now, there are four basic philosophical schools of ethics, and they're all what we would call normative ethics. There are normative ethics and non-normative ethics. Non-normative ethics is basically a description of the way people behave. without saying what they should or shouldn't do. It's just a descriptive analysis of what they do, okay? Whereas normative ethics moves further and says, here's the principle of correct moral action. Here's what you should do. Here's what you shouldn't do. Here's what you ought to do, what you ought not to do. You get the idea. So those four schools of ethics are virtue ethics, deontological ethics, utilitarian ethics, and now Nietzsche's egoistic ethics. And Nietzsche is going to follow one basic principle. Every one of these kind of boils it down to one simple principle, okay? So let's look at each one. Virtue ethics says in every situation a person should do that which is virtuous. Well, how do we know what virtue is? Well, virtue is avoiding extremes of action. Virtue is, well, moderation, okay? In other words, to use a very simple example, I don't want to be too courageous. If I go too far with my courage, I'm going to take risks that are unnecessary. And you would say, well, that's not even courage anymore. Now you're just being kind of stupid. But if I don't exude enough courage, if I lack it completely, you call me a coward. And so if I refuse to take reasonable risks, any kind of risk that a reasonable person would, you say I'm a coward. And so the whole idea of courage is finding kind of this balance in between these two extremes. And so classical virtue ethics goes along and looks at all kinds of things like this. What is generosity, et cetera, on and down the line. And the idea here is we're trying to create a person who has good character, okay? It's all about creating a virtuous people. It's character formation. But it doesn't have a bunch of rules. And so many people feel like, well, we need rules. We have to really simplify things down to just rules that we know whether you broke or whether you followed or not, okay? And so along comes a different school of ethics that says, the deontological school says that you should do your duty. And this is the Kantian view. This is Immanuel Kant's view. Deon and deontological simply is a Greek word for duty. So you should just do what your duty is. And so in all situations, you should follow what he calls the categorical imperative. And that is that in every situation, you should do that which is universalizable, which you could wish anyone to do anywhere. Okay. Next, we move on to utilitarian ethics. The idea here is that one should do that which is practical, that which leads to the best outcome for the most people. It doesn't matter what you do to get there. It's kind of the ends justifies the means approach in its worst form. But the idea is that we're concerned about the outcome, not so much what we did to get the outcome. And then along comes Nietzsche with his egoistic form of ethics and says, in all situations, one should do that which is in one's own self-interest, okay? And so this kind of leads to a moral nihilism. It leads to almost, it's an odd way of looking at morality because it's almost an amorality. What does one of Nietzsche's quotes say? He says, what does nihilism mean? That the highest values devaluate themselves. What Nietzsche held was that many of these other ethical systems had these high values or these other values, but ultimately they led to a dead end. And so he's going to go another direction. And of course the question is, does it too lead to a dead end? But Nietzsche thought that traditional moralities, the virtue ethics and the deontological ethics, the rule-based ethics and so forth, led to a kind of nihilism, a dead end where values kind of contradict themselves or they crash and burn at the end. So trying to find his way out, he championed egoism and transvaluation. Let the individual decide what is good or bad for himself or herself, and let the individual create his or her own values. So my values are for me, yours are for you. This was an attempt to avoid nihilism, but it ultimately led to another kind of nihilism. You understand that there are many kinds of nihilism, just as like there are many kinds of other movements and so forth. And so just as Kant's attempt to defeat Humean skepticism led to another form of skepticism, so Nietzsche's attempts to escape nihilism leads to a different kind of nihilism. But Nietzsche's moral nihilism gives every person the power to will his own categorical imperative. And so you come up with your own rule, if you will. He says, quote, good and evil that are not transitory do not exist, end quote. In other words, good and evil, it just comes and goes, and it really is a matter of what I like and what I dislike, or what you like and dislike. So Nietzsche's name will probably forever be associated with the word nihilism, perhaps considered its greatest prophet. He tries to avoid nihilism, and that effort will become what we will see later on, a kind of a basic form of existentialism in the 20th century. For him, there is simply no such thing as moral good or moral evil. There are only competing wills of people who like or dislike some practice.